Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this session of our Pathlock Innovation Series today. We're excited to have you here. I'm going to be putting a link in the chat right now for the rest of the sessions. We have one more session coming up today. And if you would like to go and register for that, or if you would like to register for our sessions coming up tomorrow, you can go to our website and look at the innovation series. We have more sessions coming up tomorrow. So with that, our session right now is PeopleSoft FSCM, quickly detect and mitigate compliance risks. And our presenter today is Greg Wendt. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at Pathlock. Just a few housekeeping items. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, please click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming through your speakers. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please type any questions into the questions box on your control panel for our speaker to answer at the end of the event. And to prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Greg to introduce himself.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, my name is Greg Wendt. I'm an executive director here at Pathlock. I joined the team from the Apsian Gray Heller side. So I've got about 8.5 years on the vendor side of the business. Before that, you can see that I've got a 25-year career. I've spent much of it on the customer side, running and implementing and supporting PeopleSoft systems through the years, whether that was HCM, financials, campus solutions, portal systems, ran them all, worked in oil and gas, retail, and higher ed through my career. So it really, it's one of those things being in Texas. Sorry, you kind of have to do oil and gas at some particular point in time, but it allowed me to really understand what it takes to run, implement, and control those systems. And for much of my career, I was actually dotted line to the CISOs for either incident response, understanding what was happening inside of the systems from security perspectives, and those kinds of challenges that we had. So a lot of the issues and challenges that we're talking about today, I've dealt with in the past. Also had to deal with auditors throughout all those years, which I have to say was my favorite part. Not really. So from that, let's go ahead and get started. So who is Pathlock and what do we do? So what we leverage are integrated integrations to multiple business systems to allow us to provide a 360-degree view of risk across applications. And you'll see that today. So what it really means is, especially inside of financials, is we're able to resolve SOD issues and show you that on a single pane of glass, if you want to call it that. So it allows you to understand what the risks are, what this user has the ability to access, should they be able to access, and what are the risks associated with that. We'll kind of go through that. And it helps quantify the risks that these users are able to do inside of the system, because you're able to find them very quickly. We can also do automated user access reviews and provisioning and deprovisioning. If we've got time, I might show you a little bit of that as well today. And then we can monitor user activities in real time. So I'll go into more detail on that later as well. And it helps you with compliance. You know, with a lot of the issues that you're being challenged with today, whether that's SOX, GDPR, different issues like that. What do you have to understand inside of your systems and control to be able to really deal with providing the information to be able to solve and show that you're compliant with all of these different issues. So Pathlock is also a market-leading application security and controls automation platform. So you can see some of our customers here. We've got some really large names and also some of the partners that we deal with. So we've got millions of users monitored for our customers. And one of the advantages of the whole Pathlock merger is now we've got over 500 employees around the world. So we're a much larger organization than we were before. So that helps us achieve much of what we're doing. So let's go ahead and jump into the topic today. When we start thinking about, you know, some of the challenges that we're having to deal with, one of the concerns that comes into many organizations is, what are the remediation costs? And they continue to scale rapidly. Much like all of the inflation rates we're dealing with now, things aren't getting any cheaper. when you think about the challenges and the insider threats, financials is one of those areas that really specifically has its own set of issues. Obviously, inside of HCM, you can hire and create a fake employee and those types of challenges. But when you're talking about FSCM, there's a lot of different issues and controls that need to be in place. For example, creating vendors, and then you've got, purchase orders and who should be buying things and what should they be able to buy, and are there limits on all of those things? So when you're looking at the number of insider threats, they've increased globally by 44% between 20 and 22. That's a large number. It's going to continue to increase. People are getting smarter about some of the systems that they're working with, and it's also getting harder to understand what's valid versus invalid access. How do I know if this user, Sally over in accounts payable, is really doing her job, or is this a rogue transaction? And when you try to figure out the difference between those two, it can become very complicated. And in some organizations, you might be talking about tens of thousands or millions of transactions that we're dealing with in the grand scheme of things. And how are you going to trickle through and really find those 5, 10, 15, 20 that are slipping through the cracks? It becomes very difficult to see that, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you're seeing, a rise in insider threats as well. And more than 34% of businesses worldwide were affected by insider threats each year. It's a third of us, a third of the organizations out there. Scope, how big was the threat? What happened? Was it a big breach? Was it a small breach? Was it, somebody stealing money? Was it somebody buying? What happened? So obviously there's different scale to each one of those, but, some of the larger ones everybody's heard about. Like where the lady was buying computers for $40 million. Obviously that's an insider threat, and she got away with it for a while. When we look at the, the fines and penalties due to non-compliance, this is SOX, financial requirements, GDPR, $2 million of yearly cost for the fines and penalties. Those have really changed with, some of the newer compliance regulations, because they do have teeth with them now, which is interesting, because SOX doesn't really have quote unquote financial fines to it. It was really threatening jail time and things like that, versus GDPR, for example, had a monetary fine specifically attached to it. 52% of the security events caused operational outage that negatively affected productivity. Look at your organization and think about, how often or how many times have you gone down in the last couple of years? Was that really based upon a security event? So basically half of the events, or probably somebody probing your network, maybe some sort of rogue attack, whether it's somebody who's got a hold of credentials and is accessing your system and doing things inside of there, and that brings your system down. It also hurts you negatively from how you're looked at as an organization as a whole, and how secure you are, and whether or not the outside environment, or the outside consumers, or your customers or vendors or constituents really trust you as an organization. One of the real issues around this is caused by the manual processes. They have always been a constraint. When we think about manual processes and what has to be done, let's start with provisioning a user. I'll start with the bottom one actually and kind of work my way up through this slide. But how much effort is required to provision a user? What are the security requests that need to take place? What do they need from either computers, desks, all that other kind of stuff? So obviously it's different when you're talking about a new hire, an onboarding process versus a mover, or the joiner, leaver, mover process. The leavers are going away, so they're much easier to deal with. You can turn off their access. Hopefully you do. A lot of times, sometimes that might be left, but when you're provisioning and onboarding a new user, there's a lot of different things that particular person has to go through, whether it's gaining access to HCM to update their records, getting a computer, getting a desk, capturing all of that. It's very tedious, and there's a lot of people involved. So, even inside of financials, how are we going to do that? Are we going to model them after somebody? Are we truly going to provision them and give them the roles and permissions that they should use? Are we just going to copy, Jimmy go give them Jimmy's security, for example. So, very detailed on what and how much effort it takes. And typically that's done through email. So when it gets audited and somebody's coming in after the fact, there's all sorts of cleanup that needs to be done and all sorts of reports or information that has to be pulled for that third party auditor, which is one of the reasons that causes a little bit of challenge as well. Also, how much effort is needed to maintain clean and coherent roles? Roles are something that most organizations they'll start with and they don't necessarily go back and clean up. Sometimes, as I was saying earlier, it's just mimic somebody else's security and give that security to them. Does that really give you a warm fuzzy as to what their risks are, how much they have access to? Is it really pertain to the exact access that that particular employee needs? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's precisely what they need, but there's a good chance that it's not. So, that all comes down to the maintenance level, how often you look at those role review processes, how much are you actually doing a user access review, and how often is that certified, so to say. And then also how much effort is actually needed to do and enforce SOD. SOD is a challenge. It becomes very difficult in some organizations to do. One is because sometimes it's done by design. You really don't have the size of teams that you require. So it works out that, okay, we're going to allow Sally to go through and have an SOD style violation or risk, but we know that risk and we're just willing to accept it because we don't have the number of people that we need to be able to keep that separation in place to where nobody has actually got the ability to do that. So sometimes it's by design. So it becomes very difficult in those types of scenarios to really understand, was that a valid? Was it just because, they have the ability to do it? Or was it, an intentional type of scenario? So it really comes down to people, processes, and technology. And all of them have to work together and they all have to enable the former. So they have to be closely integrated to be able to really close this gap and make much of this go away from a manual process flow. When we're talking about securing your users, applications, and data, and really the ultimate goal is you have to prove that to the world, because your third-party auditors are going to come in and that's who you're going to prove it to. Yes, you have to prove it to yourself, but those external auditors are going to come in and say, well, are you actually doing this, yes or no? So I'm going to go ahead and build out this slide a little bit, and then we can talk about it. So one of the things that we do here at Pathlock is we have real-time connections into the different systems. So those systems could be ERP systems, so PeopleSoft Financials, it could be SAP, it could be EBS, JD Edwards, whatever that system may be. They might be located in the cloud, or they could be on-prem legacy systems. Either way, doesn't really matter. And then other enterprise systems could be your identity management system, could be Salesforce, those types of scenarios, all sorts of different applications inside of your organization. So what we're going to be able to do is use those integrated connections to all of those different application sets. We're going to be able to pull down and really govern that user access by giving you an understanding of what the users have the ability, what are they authorized to do in each one of those systems. So it allows you to go through and access, analysis and look at that and look at their user access reviews, for example. So it really allows you to see what they can do. And if I were on video, you'd probably see me air quoting. Because can do is this is what that user is authorized to do in that individual system. It could be, here's what I can do in FSCM. So I'm a payables clerk. I've got these particular authorizations and that's all I can do. So very individual type of scenarios. We've also got the ability to do a did do analysis. So what that does is it really allows us, and it's really important to differentiate between these two. It allows us to monitor the business transactions. So that's really a shift in not just looking at can do, but did that user do anything? So I go back to that situation with Sally. So you don't have the staff to be able to support it. So by default or, by design, Sally has an SOD violation or risk. So what are we going to do with that? Well, the question boils down to not only does she have it, but the real question is, did she do it? That's really the risk that we're dealing with, right? Because it's, there's a lot of people that can have all sorts of authorizations who can do something, but it really boils down to the risk is really whether or not they did it or not, right? That's the differentiator, is we want to be able to tell, hey, yes, Sally did perform this risk. It's not just she was able to, she actually did this. So that's kind of the differentiating between the can do and the did do analysis there. So that brings in the monitoring of the business transactions. And really, with that monitoring of the business transactions, it allows us to understand and quantify the risks that the organization has as a whole. So we're going to be able to prioritize that by the impact, whether that's financial, information technology based, or anomalous activity, for example. So we're going to be able to differentiate those, really quantify those risks for you to be able to help you understand, all right, what does my risk profile look like? How much, where does my risk sit? And is it as an acceptable level for me within my organization? And to basically do this effectively, you have to do it all the time. This is a real world living, breathing system that's going to be changing. There's going to be new users all the time. There's new access, there's new roles, new permissions. All of this is changing on a daily basis in some scenarios because of just the influx of new hires, transitioning, changing of jobs, all of those other type of things. Maybe you're even bringing on new functionality within the application, for example. Okay, let's go ahead and bring on expenses, for example, where we weren't running it before. Well, with that is now a whole new subset of risks and all new functionality and new access and authorizations that need to take place. So that's one of the reasons why you have to look at this all of the time to be able to understand, what's happening. And with that automated testing, that's how you prove your controls that are actually working and doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is ultimately what the end goal is. You want to be able to prove it to the world that yes, the controls we have in place work. We don't have any, unanswered mitigating controls that are putting us at a higher risk profile. So that's why all of this has to work together in a concerted method moving forward to mitigate those risks for you as an organization. Another thing is when we look at it, it's really about also centrally controlling identities and managing the entitlements and governing risks that that user has. I like to talk about this more of thinking about it from a business role, so across all of your business applications, or ERP systems throughout the standalone platforms that all of your users have. You're going to be using something like, you're going to have an HCM, you're going to have a financial system, you're probably going to have some sort of CRM that could be Salesforce, you're going to have an identity management system, you're going to have all sorts of different business applications. You may have some legacy ones in here as well. So when you're looking at all of that, how are you understanding what this user's access is across all of those different application sets? So that's really where it boils down to, is if you can manage those entitlements and govern that risk in one place, it allows you to see that. So it gives you one view across all of those different applications on the other side. So I can say, all right, this AP clerk has this functionality in HCM, this functionality in Salesforce, has this functionality at Active Directory layer, and that's really what constitutes their job. This is what they need to be able to function and actually do their job. So if I understand what their authorizations are in all of those different target places, it allows me to assess my risk completely. It's very difficult when I'm looking at risk to understand risk when it's siloed. If that's all I'm looking at is FSCM, for example, and I don't include my other application sets, am I really getting a real view of the risk that I have as an organization? No, I'm not. So I need to be able to bring into effect all of these other different application sets, and it allows us to do analysis on that access. So what are those users doing? What are they doing in all of these other target systems? Are there risks because of what the user has in system A versus system B? And also we can, from an access management perspective, we can automate self-service, make the provisioning very easy One, we can do compliant provisioning to where we actually have the ability to say, all right, these are the roles, these are the authorizations that a user needs across the system. We can make that very consistent. We have a system that will go in and grant those authorizations in all those target systems as well. So we can change PeopleSoft security. You can have all of that built in. There's a workflow built around that. Kind of the same type of access for emergency access. So you have the ability to grant that just-in-time temporary user access, so that way somebody can go in, they can make some changes. Maybe it's for system support, maybe it's to go in and fix a production problem on access that they don't normally have. So you can, some people call it emergency, some people call it break glass, some people call it firefighter, whatever you want to call that. We have the ability to do that where you can track that and see, all right, what did the user access? Here they had the ability to do it. Now it's closed off. We gave it to them for a window of time. So and then also user access reviews. User access reviews are very important to do. It's something that from an organization, most groups don't love, I will say. One, because it's such an automated or such a manual process for most organizations. It really becomes a challenge, and it's not something they enjoy doing because it is so manually driven. Whether it's spreadsheets, the auditors, whoever's driving that process, it becomes very difficult because you have to provide a lot of information to them. And typically a lot of that information is offline. It's not something that you can query, create reports, and be done with. So you have to provide all of that information. They might be looking at your inbox and going through it, or the security administrator's inbox and going through it. But it is something from a user access review that you need to go through those. Real question comes up with user access reviews is how frequently are you doing them? Most of the time you need to do them twice a year as a minimum across most users. Some high privileged users, I was talking to some customers here lately, they're getting into monthly for high privileged users. With monthly is a lot, but that's really driven by their external auditors, and they're being pushed into that. So how do you manage that? Or do you want to manage a user access review monthly? When you're talking about self-service, low privileged users, maybe it's every 6 months, or quarterly or something like that. They're not really your big problem. It's the high privileged users that have access to the system, and that's where you really need to spend some time focusing on them. So when you can centrally control those identities, it really allows you to move between all of those very, very easily. When we speak specifically about improving segregation of duties, one of the challenges in many of these applications is really how to identify. How do I know that there's an SOD violation when user has role A and role B? It becomes challenging to go through that particular process. And then on the flip side, what am I going to do to resolve that? How am I going to give them the ability to function and do what they need to do, but not step over the bounds? So what do I need to do to their roles? What do I need to do for the authorizations? But it starts with uncovering those SOD conflicts and really the users and the roles. And it's, across multiple applications. If a user has the ability to do, X in financials and Y in HCM, for example, does that cause a problem? Is that a risk because they can do the two of those? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But when you have different owners, whether it's data owners or product owners, and those two people don't communicate and don't necessarily pay attention to what users have in the other systems, that's where your risks are going to increase. The other side of it is, how do we, rectify the conflicts with intelligence suggestions? What do I do to resolve the fact that this particular user can create a vendor and pay a vendor? Something like that. And then also, how do I, deal with false positives? How do I mitigate and shrink the amount of false positives that I'm going to have to deal with, moving forward as an application? Because it's not something that false positives normally increase the workload that you're having to work with and, aren't very efficient. So you want to mitigate the amount of false positives that you're actually finding out there. Access requests, and then how do you enable them? Automation and leveraging automation is going to be extremely critical to this, because one, it's going to allow you to control the risk and expedite the request, but it's also going to empower that end user to be productive. So you can have an end user make a security request. Hey, I need this access, but what do I do with that? Typically, what does your access request look like now? It's probably going to come through email, might come from the power user, the data owner. Does it get routed through the correct people? Is there the workflow? Are the approvals there? How are all of those approvals tracked? How do we know whether somebody truly had security removed, added, all of those types of things? So we want to expedite it. We want to be able to move forward with it, and we definitely want that policy-based automation of approvals. So that allows us to have that control of, hey, when this is a risk-free type of provisioning situation, let's go ahead and do that. Let's do that for the security administrator with the system so they don't have to worry about it. One is because we can control the risk, because we know that the roles or authorizations that this user is getting access to don't generate the risk. They don't have SOD style violations, because we can go back and check those, for example. So we can automatically identify those high risk access, the SOD conflicts, or abnormal access. So that way we can red flag that. We don't want to automate that process. We don't want to do this. So, maybe it's a request that came through, and as that end user made that, they're saying, hey, give me role X. And because they would get role X, now that request is going to change their authorizations completely, thus increasing the risk profile. Well, we don't want to do that. If we can catch that up front, for example, then we're not going to do that. Then we can go back to the person who was requesting it, or back to the data owner, and say, hey, look, Jimmy requested this style of access, and this is what it's going to cause. We don't want that to happen. So we know before we even grant that type of access. So you can also quickly find the right roles, matching requests with a recommendation engine as well. So what this really boils down to is automating the user lifecycle management. And you can increase your productivity and eliminate the user access risks, by automating those manual provisioning processes. Why? Because it allows you to really leverage the joiner, mover, leaver process in a way across multiple applications. It goes back to kind of what I was talking about earlier, and I kind of touched on a session earlier today of, when you look at what somebody has access to across your application set, they're going to need authorizations on 5 to 10 different pieces of software inside of your organization. Some of that's going to be higher risk than others from an authorization flow. But when you're typically talking about, let's start with an onboarding of a generic user. I'm pulling them in, I'm going to create them inside of HCM because I got to have, a way to pay them. And let's say they're going to be an AP clerk. So their job role is going to be an AP clerk. Well, if I've got clean roles, I can say, all right, this person has this department or this particular job function. I'm now going in on that joiner process to be able to create them. Inside of that, I know they're going to be an AP clerk. Now they also need to have certain functionality inside of Active Directory, for example. Maybe it's the fact that they now need the VPN to be able to work from home where other groups don't, for example. Maybe they need something inside of Salesforce. So all of that access can be granted and controlled by that holistic business role that user would need access to. Also, once again, since we're looking at it and understanding the comparisons between those, so we know if there's an SOD style violation that's going to be created by this user having that type of access. So that's what we really want to govern, is that control. The other side of it is, if it's an automated, it's going to be extremely consistent, so that user's not going to end up with controls or authorizations that they shouldn't have, because the system's going to take care of granting the exact same thing, especially when you're talking about onboarding or flipping that to the leaver process. All right, well, how do we do W-2s? Do they need access to a different platform? Outside of that, obviously, let's remove financials. They don't need access to that. So let's take that away right away. We can automate that entire process to clean that up and remove all of the authorizations inside of the target systems that they don't need anymore, and just leave them with the bare minimum for whatever the requirements are as an ex-employee. So all of that can be done through automation, and we can kind of talk about that a little bit today. So When we get into that whole access governance lifecycle, and that's really what it boils down to, is how and what you're going to do with these authorizations. And it is a massive life cycle, especially inside of trying to manage all of this. So when we think about creating and maintaining our access roles and rules, that's going to happen in our role design. And as I was talking about earlier, you can look at that more holistically to where it's not just one single targeted role. Um, you can do it very tactically like that, where it's kind of a one-to-one if you want to, but you can also design your roles to where this is, okay, I am an AP clerk or an expense, approver. Well, as an expense approver, what does that mean? What all do I need access to inside of the system and outside of the system to be able to function with that? So that's where we can bring in those other application sets. And through the provisioning and deprovisioning, that's where we're really applying the role-based access controls. So that's making sure the user gets the correct roles, permission lists to be able to function and do that job. Or in the situation of deprovisioning, removing all of that type of access. So it's something that we want to make sure is cleaned up. Yes, if you've got the policies of maybe this particular person has moved jobs and they need to kind of play in a gray area where they're doing two jobs or both jobs for a week or two while they're training somebody, that's fine too. We can make sure they leave those authorizations with that person for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. That can all be set up to where it's then automatically controlled and cleaned up for you. Then also, the question really boils into how are we going to do access requests? Because there's always going to be changes to what the security model is that's out there. So, somebody's going to be testing, somebody's going to be looking at new functionality. Maybe you're interested in deploying new functionality, going back to the example of expenses. Maybe you're not running expenses and you want to implement that now. So people need to be able to request additional access into the system, and you want to have that in a controlled environment that is also very consistent with your provisioning and deprovisioning. So we can manage those access requests compliantly. That's where we can also compare, whether a role that somebody is asking for is creating an SOD violation. What's happening with this? So, and you want to be able to, really efficiently go through the user access reviews. Whether that's automating the process completely to where it occurs quarterly or monthly, depending upon what user constituent you're looking at, but you want it to be an automated process flow. The second part about that is it needs to be systematically done and tracked. So okay, somebody's going through and looking at roles. What does this particular user have? Should they have that? Do we want to take it away? All of those things should be built into the system holistically. And then when you're looking at SOD audits, sample testing, and violation management, one, how are you doing your audits? Are you actually looking at a large enough sample testing group to find? And it really boils down to continuous and complete coverage on your sample testing. If you can test or validate against everything, then you don't have to worry about the individual sample test, and that only being 2 to 3% of your transactions, for example. And then what are you going to do for a violation management? How are you going to handle those exceptions? Are you going to allow it? Going back to that example of earlier of, well, we don't have the team size, so we're going to allow this from Sally, and she's going to be able to do that. So by design, you can have the system work the way you want to. So let's go ahead and jump in and demo at this particular point in time. So I am going to flip over screens here real quickly. And one of the things that I wanted to start with is let's look at mitigating or finding risks, because that's one of the things that we want to do quickly is understand what our risks are. So I'm going to go into the Pathlock system here, and I'm going to look at the access, and I want to look specifically at accounts. So what we're doing here is we're going to be able to filter the accounts. So as I look through here, you can see the systems. They've got access to multiple different systems. So I've got JD Edwards, EBS, Ariba, all of those types of things. I can also see the risk level. What does that mean? So I've got a single pane of glass to be able to understand what my users are doing. So I'm going to filter with PeopleSoft here real quick and then go ahead and hit display. So I can see my risks, what type of counts I have, But the risks, what this is looking at here is actually SOD violations. So I can come down a little bit further and look to see the individual users that I have inside of my PeopleSoft system. So we can see that we don't have any risks attached to several of my users. We can also see that I've got a high risk with Dan here and some critical risks when we're talking about Jacob and Kelly, for example. So what happens if I drill into that individual account? So what we're going to do here is we're pulling the information. So this is a feed coming in from PeopleSoft that's actually looking at their permissions and what this user has access to. And then we're comparing it to an SOD rule set. That SOD rule set is going to tell us where those risks lie. So just general information on the account, for example, and then I'm going to look at the roles. So what role does this user have inside the system? I can drill into that. I can actually look at the role overview, see what they actually have content to, what the activities are. So if you want to think about it at the activity level, what this really is the menu or the component and page that this user has access to. So this is, the finite control of, what this user has access to be able to see. You can see they're also an account payable manager is the role that we're dealing with. So I'm going to go back to Dan, look at the user profile. And now let's look at the risks that they have. So some of the risks, and we can see the severity of the risk is high. So what it is we've got the SOD rules, the segregation of duty rules that are built and defined. And what we have found is that this particular user, through their roles, has certain elements that match the definition for that SOD. So we can see there's certain roles with the risks, for example, and users with the risks. So we can kind of drill into those. But let's actually look at the elements. So I'm going to pull this open a little bit. And what this is really showing me is that a user has two different activities. And because they have the two different activities, that thus causes the separate or segregation of duties violation. So because they're able to create a voucher and do a voucher override, that creates the ability for them to go into the system and perform an SOD violation, thus increasing the risk for the organization. So we want to think about it from what the user is really being able to do. This is all within the PeopleSoft system, and the activity is basically the component and page that they have write access to, that they can then open up, work with, and make changes to the system. So that's really what we're talking about with the activities and what is included within there. As I look at the risks, we can see that we have 3 different employees that have this access. We can see that the usernames, what they're accessing inside of the system, we can look at the individual details or approve, all of that, what roles are actually causing this problem. So when we look at the roles themselves, obviously in this scenario, this is a delivered role coming out of PeopleSoft. So when we're looking at the accounting manager, there's 8,600 activities in that role. You probably wouldn't build a role with 8,600 activities, or at least I hope you wouldn't. But that allows you to understand, hey, there's a lot of activities inside of this situation. And the business role, the higher level role that we're working with this is the accounts payable. So we're, can see all of those different understanding in one particular place. So we can drill in and get a little bit more information. So it puts it into a little bit more layman's terms of understanding, hey, if somebody has this particular violation, this is what they're able to do, and what it would cause from a risk perspective. So, this is what having the ability to do these 2 activities does for your organization as a whole. So, if I look at a different account, we're going to see that it's very, very different on the roles that the user has. So we've got grants, and their risks are very different as well. So what we're doing is taking in those roles. We're taking a feed from the PeopleSoft system, looking at their roles, their permissions, and then comparing them, like I said, to that SOD violation or the rule set that we have to then map whether or not these people have different challenges inside of your organization. So that's one of the reasons why when we're talking about being able to go through and do role analysis in user access reviews, we can say, hey, this user has a particular role and they're able to do this inside of the system, and this is going to cause trouble for the organization because there's a risk based to this role because of what's allowed for that user to do inside of the system. So it's just something I wanted to show you real quickly. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and really kind of wrap up here. So from the, as you saw, this is really a cost-effective solution. I showed some of the provisioning and deprovisioning on an earlier session today, so it's something that if you want to see, we can definitely show you that as well. But it's efficient. It allows you to create workflows, but it integrates those workflows with the joiner, mover, leaver process, but it also enables you to do an SOD check inside of that provisioning. So when somebody is requesting, or if there's going to be an SOD violation created due to that automation, then it's going to need an approval, those types of things. It also allows you to manage your role-based access controls, which is RBAC proactively. So you can move away from very complex mitigation because it allows you to understand, oh, if I give a user role A and they already have role B, is this going to cause a problem? Is this going to increase my risk? Yes, we can tell you that. We can tell you that right away from a proactive situation. So you can go through and do modeling and simulations of changing people's roles, their access, what their permissions are inside of the different transactions that they already have. So it allows you to really tighten that up from that perspective to really control your SOD and prevent fraud inside of your applications. So you can build your own risk matrix. You can add in, because everybody is going to have some of their own custom SODs. Granted, we're going to deliver, but you're going to have your own that your organization is going to have to deal with as well. So you can easily satisfy your auditors because they're able to pull it up and look at it and understand what's happening. And it's really simplifying access reviews as well. So when you're working with having to understand that and go through that particular process, we've got entire workflows that are built around that user access review to where the automation takes place. It can be done quarterly, monthly. It's going to come directly to your inbox. You're not going to have to worry about it. And then you can go through and do whatever the checks and balances that you need to go through to certify those particular users' access inside of your system. The nice part is with that automation, it's all audited and it's all tracked. So when you're talking about future reviews, you can look back, you can see some of the documentation that may have been added in from additional ones in the past. So ties that all together. So really is a very cost-effective solution, and it really protects your PeopleSoft FSCM data and streamline your risk management. So when you can identify those SOD conflicts in minutes, because you can see, oh, Jimmy has the ability to do X and Y. Well, that's a risk. I don't want them to be able to do that. I need to go mitigate that, whether that mitigation happens to be just changing the security that they're working with, or maybe you're putting in additional mitigations like some sort of either data masking or multi-factor authentication. You can layer in both of them at that particular point. So it really allows you to unlock process efficiencies and provisioning and that lifecycle management side. Because it does have those controls for you. The nice part about it is if you do, much of your easier access, for example, let's say that you're going to provision about 70% of the stuff. Well, then it allows your security analysts and administrators to really worry about the 30% that's really difficult. Get rid of the low-hanging fruit, automate that, make it very simplistic and consistent and controlled. That way, when you're looking at how you're performing those transactions, it's going to take away the manual processes that somebody's going to have to go through. It's going to be able to automate that, whether it's automating offboarding, for example, what do I do for an offboard? Well, we can completely automate that. what do we need to get rid of? Get rid of all of the access inside of FSCM, for example. We also need to get rid of, certain access inside of maybe other applications as well. So we can take care of that and wrap all that up together to where, when an employee does leave, that's all done for you. The security administrator doesn't have to go in and do it. So when the system is going to do it, it's going to be more complete and consistent. So, and it's going to keep me more compliant moving forward. So that really increases your efficiencies inside of your organization as a whole, because you're going to be able to focus on the areas that are higher risk. For the example, going back to Sally, where maybe it's by design that she has an SOD violation and it's okay. Well, maybe Sally needs some additional monitoring from an audit perspective. So it allows you to spend time focusing on her and not the menial tasks that aren't important to your organization. So one of the things that I did want to mention is we are giving away a Starbucks gift card if you schedule a demo by 12/31. So by the end of the year, you would be able to get a Starbucks gift card as well. So with that, I will open it up for any questions and bring Stephanie back in.
Thank you, Greg. Again, if you have any questions, please add them now into the question box. And while we are waiting for those, we just wanted to say thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us at info@pathlock.com or events@pathlock.com, and we will make sure that we get back to you. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you very much, and we hope to see you at future events.